Brian Windhorst just dropped a bombshell of news revolving around this Boston Celtics team and leading into their future. As we all know with the Celtics, they have some salary cap restrictions and some things that are going to be hindering this team's plausibility going deeper into the luxury tax. And with some disappointing play over these last couple of days, change could be coming for this team faster than we know it. So Patrick and I are here on Celtics Digest to break down and dive into what we think could happen to this Celtics team, exploring those options that Brian Windhorst talked about earlier today. We'll be getting into all of that and more on this episode of Celtics Digest. And Patrick, how you been, my guy? Some good topics to talk about on today's episode.
Yeah, been better. Hopefully the Celtics play better, I'll be much better. But definitely some conversations to be had. With how they've been playing, I think this is the right conversation to be brought up. Like, there's a lot of things that are going into next year as well, and it's just, this could really happen. It could really happen sooner than later, and I think the conversations would have to start a little bit earlier, so I think it's good to touch on them now.
Yeah, I think it's great that we touch base on this, really get into it. And without further ado, Patrick, let's kind of get into the report here. It's a major little update here revolving around the Celtics team. Unfortunately, as you guys have been seeing, as Patrick and I have been seeing, it just hasn't been great basketball from the Celtics over these last couple games in those closing moments. They've been able to hold out for a majority of the game and win for the most part, but fallen short. And now we're down 2-0 versus the New York Knicks. And Brian Windhorst had a report relating to that today, talking about how there's a possibility that this team might not come back the same, specifically if they lose in this spot. And this is something Patrick and I have been looking at what this Celtics team have discussed and brought upon talking about on this channel, but it definitely is something to monitor and keep an eye on as well when revolving around this team, because like we said, Patrick, in previous videos, this team is tied up into the salary cap, right? $230 million, and some of these players on this team are just getting older as well, right? Al Horford, Kristaps Porziņģis, Jrue Holiday, and even though they've been great players to kind of fill in the roles and necessarily take the Celtics over the hump, with their salary cap restrictions and their big paydays, Porzingis on that $30 million deal, Holiday on that $40 million deal. It is very tough for the Celtics to be able to shell this money to these guys while also keeping their stars happy and trying to make moves on the edges as well with building this team.
Yeah, I think that this was a topic of conversation many times, especially with if this team was able to go back-to-back, what this team would look like. I think a lot of people thought that everyone would just be back and they kind of bite the bullet that way. But with how things are going, even if they do end up winning, I think that changes probably still will be made. Just because of how they've been playing, it's been a little bit streaky. All these guys on the contracts, Porzingis really dealing with that illness for a very long time now. One of the weirdest situations we probably ever see in the last couple of years. And I think that they have some worries now with some of these guys, and there might have to be a little bit of a retooling with this team. But you can only trust the guys around them. But I think this is something that we're really gonna have to get into a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's something definitely to keep an eye on. Once again, like you mentioned with the Celtics team, getting closer and closer to the end of this regular season, regardless if they make it past this next round, make it to the finals, regardless of what happens, there is going to be some sort of changes revolving around this team, right? We know that they have to add some players, and even if those changes are, losing key free agents like we see at the bottom, and Al Horford and Luke Cornett, that might be just the justifications if they can't get a trade done. So Patrick, because of that, we're going to dive in and we're going to look at some possibilities for the Celtics team and possibilities that they could make to make these moves in these trades and who could possibly be gone. And the first player we're going to be talking about is the first player you kind of alluded to, talking about the illness, and that's Kristaps Porziņģis. I know a lot of Celtics fans are on the negative side with Porzingis here with this recent stretch in the playoffs. Hasn't been great so far, and ultimately for this Celtics team, hasn't relatively been needed in the playoffs over these last two seasons, right? Has obviously added and is that spectacular piece when he's playing at his A1, taking the Celtics over the top. But when he's not, it hasn't been able to help the Boston Celtics in any regard.
Yeah, I really think that this whole illness thing is really kind of stepping him up as that first guy out, if there was anyone. Because like we keep talking about, they're keeping things silent, and I think they're keeping it silent for a reason. So hopefully that they can get a good little package out of some of these guys. And I think that Porzingis is one of those guys that they're really keeping quiet. He hasn't really been showing up for the Celtics in the playoffs, and they could definitely use him a lot in these last few games. I think just him, how he spreads the court and all that. He can still play at a very high level, don't get me wrong, but you just get into a very uncomfortable situation to where it's like, how much longer do you want to deal with this, especially with how much he's worth on that contract? It might not be worth it for the Celtics in the long run.
Yeah, I would agree. And if we want to look at Porzingis' stats on the season here, we can see very solid contributions for the Celtics. 19.5 points, almost 7 rebounds, 2 assists, almost 2 blocks at 1.5, 48% from the field, 41% from 3. So we know when Kristaps Porziņģis is playing at his best basketball, his peak for this Boston Celtics team, we can trust in him, we can believe in him, we know he's going to come through and deliver. But unfortunately, dealing with these illnesses, dealing with these injuries has been a hindrance with Kristaps Porziņģis' game, even before he arrived to Boston, but still affecting him with his time in Boston. And like you mentioned, that $30 million contract might be that little telling piece to let go of, especially if they want to keep some other bigs on this team. Now, next we're going to don't want to dive into Sam Hauser just yet, but Jrue Holiday, as he's once again the other veteran that's kind of there, obviously with the ascension of Peyton Pritchard, 6th man of the year this year. A lot of people could argue that you could trade Jrue Holiday and bring him up, but what we've seen with Jrue Holiday's absence, the Celtics like structure on the defensive side, and I still think if they traded Jrue Holiday, they'd still need that scrappy, pest slash, defensive beast off the bench still needed for this lineup if they were to make a move like that, even if it is cheaper.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I do enjoy Jrue Holiday being on the Celtics as well, but I just think that contract is still also really rough as well, especially with his age. I mean, he's become a better 3-point shooter as well, which has definitely helped. But I mean, again, I think that age is becoming an issue, and they're really at a point where Peyton Pritchard needs to be starting games for this team and really start getting more valuable minutes, because he does get some valuable minutes in those third quarters when they're trying to make a run. They rely on him to make a lot of big shots, and I think that he can become more of a facilitator. I mean, that'll definitely change the game for the Celtics, but obviously defensively you miss a little bit of that, but this team is great defensively in a lot of aspects, whether you go from the 1 to the 5, but I mean, you really can't make up for a Hall of Fame defender regardless. I mean, unless that there was somebody, on the Wizards maybe that would want to come back and play for the Celtics on a cheap contract. I mean, I don't know. I don't know who that could be though, Bruce. I mean,
yeah, I don't know who that is either. Maybe someone that they maybe.
I don't know. Maybe. But yeah, I mean, there's really not too many guys that are like Jrue Holiday, and I mean, that's definitely a piece that won't really be filled in exactly. But I think that Peyton Pritchard is definitely worthy of getting the starting position, and with how this contract and age are looking, I think that these are the top 2 guys to really get off of their contracts or maybe even restructure. But, I mean, I don't really see that much happening either.
Yeah, I would agree. We obviously know that the Celtics traded for these guys to take them over that hump, right? Get them into that playoff spotlight, into that championship sphere. But then after that, we knew this wasn't going to be a long haul, even if they were able to retain these guys on some cheap deals or solid deals for their production. But if the Celtics want to keep those guys, right, stay with this veteran movement, potentially go into those guys, some other guys they could look at could be towards the bottom of the roster, I think, and that not towards the bottom, but towards the middle, I would say. And that's where guys like Sam Hauser kind of come into play, obviously making right around $11 million this season for the Celtics. Has seen some injuries, hasn't been that spark 3-point shooter that we saw last season for the Boston Celtics, but still playing some solid basketball. And I think Hauser, especially with the immersion of Baylor Shimer potentially next season, even though they play a little bit of a different role on the wing, could take up that scoring alongside Peyton Pritchard for the Celtics to move off of him and potentially get another role, or even just shed some salary for some draft picks to really invest into some guys like Shimer or Jordan Walsh that can take that next step for this team.
Yeah, I'm in a weird spot with Sam Hauser. I loved him coming up. I remember him in college. I remember him coming up, telling everyone, I'm like, look, this guy's going to be legit. He's a great shooter. He'll just let him develop. He'll take some time. That's really what he's turned into. But I think that come free agency, he's going to get some money. And I don't know if the Celtics are going to be able to compete with that. So they're definitely going to get into an uncomfortable situation, but they got to see how comfortable they are with the Baylor Shireman and, of course, Peyton Pritchard with the shooting as well. But, I mean, they draft well, so I could definitely see the Celtics going out and maybe getting another shooter. But I really do think that he's going to bring in some money in free agency, Bruce.
Yeah, and then lastly, the other free agent for the Boston Celtics here, Luke Cornett. And similarly, we talked about when Kristaps Porziņģis here is obviously the Celtics can keep him and potentially lose guys like Horford and Cornett in free agency. But Cornett has provided himself as one of the best underrated bigs, best value bigs across the NBA. I went over this in a video earlier today, so if you want to see some more depth details on Luke Cornett, go check that out. But I think the Celtics are kind of forced into a tough decision with Luke Cornett here, right? Because do they want to trade Kristaps Porziņģis, bring Luke Cornett potentially on an MLE deal if they drop to the first apron, or a team-friendly deal, or do they want to lose Luke Cornett and still run with Kristaps Porziņģis? I think ultimately that does become a discussion heading into this offseason with the ascension of Luke Cornett and how he's been able to play for the Boston Celtics.
Yeah, I think he's definitely a guy that you want to keep around. Definitely great in the locker room, loved by all the guys. I mean, him and Tatum in that pick and roll, like we talked about, sometimes being second best in the league, and I think that's huge, especially one of your star players having a connection like that with the center. I mean, is he going to be able to give you 30 minutes a game though? Not sure, but I mean, again, you got to fill in these roles somehow, and that's what happens when you have to pay a lot of guys a lot of money. That's why, Bruce, we talked about that little March Madness draft where Janai Broom kind of falls at that 28th spot. Maybe you draft a guy like him in the draft and kind of just rely on somebody who's a great defender as well, but not really going to, pick up the same role as Porzingis as when it comes to stretching the floor. But, I mean, Luke Cornett, I think, is a guy that not only Celtics fans, but the players also want to keep around.
Yeah, I would agree, and I love how you brought up that point, because I think that's another way the Celtics can kind of potentially fill in this hole for Luke Cornett is through the draft if they were to lose him in free agency. But with all of these top possibilities and topics, we all know, Patrick, that some sort of change is going to happen, right? So we don't necessarily know who those players are going to be, what's going to be happening, but something will change to restructure this roster, regardless if it's players leaving in free agency. And this is something shown not just from championship teams, but teams that have won a championship in the past. Their structure is just not able to sustain because guys outperform their roles, play in better positions, and it's just the reality of the NBA. With the Celtics still having Tatum and Brown, they'll still be able to mold and, put good players around them to keep them in those championship contention and stuff like that, but it might not just be with this same roster. So once again, thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode here where Patrick and I looked at this report from Brain Windhorst and really went into detail on who could be the possibilities that could be leaving for the Boston Celtics. I want to know your thoughts down below in the comment section. If there's anyone that we didn't name that you think could be on the out, let us know down below in the comment section. And if you agree with any of our takes, let us know down below. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day, and go Boston Celtics. Peace out, everyone.